Welcome, everyone. My name is Kristen Tollefson. I'm the Education Director here at the Bainbridge Island Museum of Art. And I wanted to thank you all really wholeheartedly for showing up tonight to hear Linda Bierds talk and speak from her new book, read poetry from her new book. I'm sorry, talk, speak, read, all of the above. I just want to acknowledge that this group manifested, kind of out of thin air, but I just want you to look around and see this wonderful community of committed friends and poetry lovers who exist on this island, and I can't be more thrilled to be a witness to that. After the reading, we will be gathering again in the bistro. You'll have a whole new set of glasses to choose from. And please stay and enjoy some food and drink and conversation, and Linda's books will be for sale. She will be signing books as well. I'd like to introduce David Lewis, who is going to in turn introduce Linda. Thanks.
Good evening and welcome to what is another wonderful event at the Bainbridge Island Museum of Art. Many of you are already familiar with Linda and her poetry, and for those that are here tonight for the first time, for her first reading, we are all in for a real treat. Although internationally known, Linda has called Bainbridge Island her home for over 20 years, where she quietly writes, teaches, and supports the arts. She is passionate about her craft. Her poems have appeared in over 100 journals and anthologies, including The Atlantic, The New Yorker, and the Smithsonian. Her many awards include fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Guggenheim Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, and most notably, in 1998, a Genius Grant from the MacArthur Foundation. Her ninth book, which you will read from tonight, Roget's Illusion, has already received starred reviews. The Library Journal named her new book as one of its top 2014 titles. And Booklist wrote, "Bierds is enthralled by light. Her fresh and agile inquiries into our perceptions attune us to how we use science and art to venerate the living world and keep the ghosts at bay." David Barber, poetry editor of The Atlantic, wrote, "With her sure prowess for crafting language that's both fiercely attentive and delicately nuanced, Bierds time and again demonstrates her own exemplary gift for holding the world's marvels up to scrutiny." And my favorite quote, "She approaches each poem as Fellini approached film, with an infinite capacity for wonder." Irish poet and 1995 Nobel laureate Seamus Heaney once described poetry as testimonies to the fact that poets themselves are finders and keepers, that their vocation is to look after art and life by being discoverers and custodians for the unlooked for. That is our Linda. And now to read from her book, Roget's Illusion, friend and poet Linda Bierds.
Well, I thank all of you for coming. I thank David for that wonderful introduction. Kristen Tollefson was here and gone in a moment, but the work that she has done for this event over the last weeks is amazing. I couldn't ask for anybody to pay more attention to the needs of the event, and my sense was she paid that from the inside as an artist looking at what another artist might need. I want to thank Cynthia Sears, who, without her, I don't think you would be wined tonight, and certainly without her vision, we wouldn't be sitting right here at all. So those are the thanks, and to my students who came over from Seattle and family, thank you also for doing that. It means a lot to me. I wanted to take a moment to talk to you a little bit about the title of the book. And I'm the type of poet who wants to introduce poems, so I will sort of set the scene for where they came from and a little bit of what I'm trying to do within them. That the Roget that you're thinking of, the Roget that I think of, is the Roget of the thesaurus, who, at least I've used the book every day of my writing life, and never thought to look at the page that is inside every edition. No matter how many editions it goes through, there's a little biography of him. And it turns out that he was a scientist. And he was at one time looking out of his door through a picket fence, and he saw a carriage passing by. And he noticed, because of the apertures of the fence, that the carriage wheels the spokes appeared to be turning backward, which is the kind of illusion that we have in film, that there's something happening there that, anyway, got Roget's interest. So he wrote a whole paper on what he thought was causing that optical illusion for the wheels to appear to be spinning backward when they were in fact going forward. So if you should Google Roget's illusion, that's what will pop up, a wagon wheel turning backward. My idea in writing this book was to think about the illusion or the striving to find all the nuances of language, all of the permutations of words that can help us communicate with one another. And that was his lifelong project. He knew it would never be finished. Language is a living thing. It will never find all of its definitions. But those two things working together, the optical illusion, the illusion of what words can do, they might have a finite border, that came into being in writing this book. I'm not an autobiographical poet, so all of my inspiration comes from the lives of other people. So you're going to hear tonight some of those people or some of the luminous images that have arrested me, but not anything that has to do directly with the self. That's it. So I want to start with a poem that I wrote when I was in London. I went to the Toy Museum in the eastern part of London and spent a whole morning there, and I was fascinated to find out that toys going back centuries, they've always wanted to simulate human movement. So I just started taking notes, and one of the dolls they had was named Miss Auto Peripateticos, the one who could walk by herself. And then there's Gustav the Climbing Miller, and any number of other dolls were there. But so it started me thinking, and you will hear in this poem a reference to you, and that is the sheep, E-W-E. And I would like to dedicate this poem to Richard Stein and to the memory of his father. Simulacra. Before the beak of a tiny pipette dipped through a glisten of DNA, and you quickened to you with exactly the simulacrum 40,000 years had worked toward. Before Muybridge's horses cantered, and a Ratchet and Paul Cast waltzing couple shuffled along a phasmatrope. before dime-size engines sparked in the torsos of toddler dolls and little bellows let them sing, and the unassisted walking one, Miss Auto Peripateticos, stepped in her caterpillar gait across the new world's wide plank floor. Before motion moved the figures and torsion moved the motion, or steam, or sand, or candle flame. Before magnets and taut springs nudged Gustav the climbing miller up his mill's retaining wall, and gravity retrieved him. Before image like sound stroked through an outreach of crests and troughs, and corresponding apertures caught patterns in the waves, caught like eels beneath ancestral ponds, radiance in the energy. Before lamposcope and zogroscope, phantascope and panorama, before lanterns recast human hands or a dye drop of beetle first fluttered across a flicker book of papyrus leaves. Someone sketched a creature along the contours of a cave, its stippled monochromatic shape tracing the vaults and hollows, shivers of flank and shoulder already drawing absence nearer, as torchlight set the motion and shadow set the rest. A companion poem to this in the Font de Gamme cave in southern France, one of the last caves you can go into that actually has the original cave paintings. They have a little booklet that lists every single beast that they have, all of the different shapes that they found, and I was interested that of all of the things they listed, they had one bear, and have always been deeply troubled by what's happening to the polar bears, and so something about that bear and that feeling that I have spurred this particular poem. An aside fact, I didn't realize that if you polish silver or some metal with a polished cloth that has a little bit of grit to it perhaps, you will get all kinds of lines on the metal. But if you hold a candle up, all of those zigzagging lines will align into concentric circles. So, notes from prehistory. Font de Gamme. At Font de Gamme, the bison 80 bulge out from their spindle legs and, quickened by candlelight, inch a half step closer to flint-carved human hands and 19 tectiforms. Across the cave, sketched to trace its contour lines, 24 mammoths stir, and oxen, 8, 4 capridae, 1 feline, 2, 1 bear, not white of course, although calcitic film spawned across the centuries has powdered it, not violet-mouthed, not iceberg drawn, walking past the confluence of James and Hudson Bays, out and out, the ice too sparse, a thin chivalric cape laid down on the endless water. 6 varied signs, or 5, cone, canopy, headless ampersand, swirled by lichen and manganese. Not nebular, those swirls, not polychrome, not cast in sheets across a bay, solar flared, electric, green on muted red. 1 slender, triforked cave, thin-branched as a sapling, 1 rubicon, 1 terminal diverticulum, one bear, quickened in place, stopped on a lozenge of stone, a shrinking, fisher-crafted raft above a canopy beneath an ampersand. Here and there, the stone like ice is water-polished or scoured by flint to a silver sheen, scratch marks zigging this way and that. Like magic, a candle's light would shape the marks, erratic, pin-thin lines drawn up to concentric rings. Illusion, of course, mirage, not symmetry, not grace, just flint and form and a resin torch to venerate the living world and keep the ghosts at bay. The book looks, as I said, at a number of figures, artists and scientists, and one that I wanted to share with you, who makes an appearance a number of times, is Albert Dürer, the 16th century artist, actually began in the 15th century. He, and you'll hear this in a later poem, was a grand sort of journal keeper. He kept facts on everything he spent, everything he bought, and so all of the details that you'll hear in this poem actually came from Dürer's journals. He had heard that a whale had been beached some distance from where he lived, and he was determined to go and see that whale because he hadn't had the opportunity to see a lot of the animals that he drew. He drew them by rumor. People would come through, they would describe a rhinoceros, he would then draw what he thought they had said, and so he said, I'm going to go and see that whale. So off he goes. You're going to hear in this poem a reference to Antigone, who, that was the name evidently that people gave to the bones that they had found of what they thought was a giant. So this, I think this will come through as the poem goes on. Dürer, near 50. At dawn on St. Barbara's Eve, just below the plateau of his 50th year, Albert Dürer, first having purchased spectacles, shoes, and an ivory button, rode a wheel-etched swath of longitude from Antwerp to Zealand, where a whale 100 fathoms long pulsed on the dark sand. First having purchased snuffers and furnace brown, and coated the pages of his silver point sketchbook, where his scratch lines, like pears or tarnish or thought, would gradually ripen. He circled Zealand's 7 shores, past Goas and Wolfersdijk, and the sunken place where rooftops stood up from the water. Already from thought, he had sketched a dozen tail-locked sirens, and once, gossip's composite, a paisleyed rhinoceros with a dorsal horn, and so would see firsthand a whale, having changed in Antwerp of Philip's florin, and dined with the Portuguese, and studied the bones of the giant Antigone, although in fact the bones were whale, while the whale Dürer sailed toward was history, erased by degrees on the outgoing tide. Still, history tells us, from his spot on that salty prow, Dürer drew precisely the unseen sight, the absent arc of its sunken shape, the absent fluke and downturned eye, even, it appears, the absent trench the acid sea had bitten so seamlessly back into the world. I was at the Stanwood Camino Fair, and a few years ago saw in the crafts barn this magnificent half-scale model of a tractor made from 20 different woods. And the woodworker had spent a number of years crafting every piece of this tractor. And it was absolutely beautiful. And it sat there with the quilts and the jarred tomatoes and this glorious glowing thing. And next to it was a tabletop diorama, a kind of living sculpture made of vines and fruit and grain, and it was a wagon wheel. So this is called 1918 Huber Light 4, which is the name. I wrote to the woodworker, and he wrote back and told me the woods he used, and he told me the name of the tractor, because I never would have been able to know. 1918 Huber Light 4. To say that it glowed, the tractor's half-scale replica, its 20 polished woods seamless and separate as a tract of furrows filled with rain, is to offer the finish before the start, the worm before the jig. Yet to say late sun cast through the fair's barn-turned-exhibition hall burnished it, as it burnished the jars of yellow beets, shifts agency to a higher power. 3 years, the woodworker said, 2,000 hours drawing walnuts brindled light, and whatever light the willow offered, the cedar and birch, the African mahogany. Almost alchemy, how sanding transformed wood to grain, almost chemistry, friction, air, vapors beneath the polished cloth, almost complete combustion, the perfect half-scale whole of it, clean as the flame some candles offer. Though to say that it drew from its absent shape, as candles do, suggests a labor less touched by time, or a time less touched by absence. Hour by hour, something like harmony passed through the room, while something like melanin rose in the model's polished wood, in the Cafford dahlias and sawdust floor, and then darkened a tabletop tapestry, the spokes of grain and braided vines arranged like a living wagon wheel, and darkened the wheel hub's gathered quince, and a slender ripple of corn silk wind, illusion's ancient artifact, thin strands stretching out from a back-cast rim to show that a stillness was turning. And that's sort of the first movement of the book. As it goes forward, it is going to include Virginia Woolf and some of the scientists. And I wanted to share one poem with you, and then later in the book, one or two others that is inspired by Virginia Woolf. When she was writing her novel, The Waves, she didn't know whether to call it The Waves or The Moths. And she went back and forth in her journal, I'll do this, I'll do that. A lot of the images that you'll hear in this poem came from her journals, but one of them was from my own life and hiking in the one of the trails. I came across a child who was trying to feed turtles in a lake, and the turtles were coming forward. He was throwing bread out to them, and they came forward, but I think they were a little afraid, and evidently the child's parents said, "Don't get in that water," so he couldn't go forward, they couldn't advance, And they seemed to me, because I was coming from above, this static figure of longing, this sort of arc, and then this other arc, and then this little fellow trying to toss the bread out. So the poem is called Navigation, and a quote from Virginia Woolf: "Waves or moths or whatever it is to be called. If it is to be the waves, then the moon perhaps, waiting a sexton's upper shelf, with the sea a shelf below some traveler's feet. Planets, time, position line, and the place is fixed, invisibly. If it is to be the moths, then something about their flight. April, perhaps. In the window, the night-blooming horn of a gramophone, and over the fields, moths flying, holding their brief shapes in constant angle to a planet's light. If it is to be the waves, the sextant and salt, then nothing to see at first but stars and indices. Not the wake's pale seam, not a fin or foremast, not even the daylit band of the past, just under the earth's horizon. Not yet, at least. No story. A lamp, perhaps, a flower pot. No past with its child, stopped by a lake in her stiff shoes, towing the placid water. Arm's length before her, in an arc, dollops of bread bob, and beyond the bread, in a second arc, a dozen hand-sized turtles treading in place. They cannot eat, the moths. A little nectar, a little sap, mandibles gone, just a slender tubal tongue wound like a watch spring in their hollow throats, and afraid the turtles will not eat, the shadow of the back-cast child rippling toward them as one by one new dollops of bread drop. If it is to be the waves, then cycles on cycles, eternity, plurality, even the rogue absorbed. If it is to be the moths, then singleness and brevity, great brevity, although in the leaves behind the child they are just beginning to stir, the day's late light caught in the orbs of the early lamps. And what is that feeling shaking its wings within her? Late day, the leaves and bread and urgency, all the curious curved shapes treading in place. If she took a step backward, would they in an arc draw nearer, as a ring might follow its planet? What then would she make of the world? The next poem is a pantoum, and for those who aren't familiar with this form, it is 4-line stanzas. The second and fourth line of one stanza become the first and third lines of the next stanza. Although I've taken a little liberty with the actual arrangements. The classical pantoum would not. They would absolutely repeat every line in its proper order and rhyme nonetheless, and this doesn't do that. At the end of the poem, the lines that opened it, the first and third, flip. So they close the poem. So the line you hear at the beginning is the line you'll hear at the end. In looking for something else, I ran across an entry on the Mirror, and it said that a mirror, in order to reflect an object, the whole of it, has to be at least half the size of that object, or it won't hold it. It has something to do with physics that I know nothing about, but I was enchanted with it. And I went down to the kitchen and I stood there and I've got a little mirror and I kept backing up and it never reflected all of me, so I bought it. I thought, this is true. It has to be half the size in order to hold it all. So this is a Pantoum. The British scientist Michael Faraday makes a number of appearances in the book, and he's here in this poem. So imagine him, he's on a stage talking to you. He has a tiny mirror, and he has a big gooseneck lamp next to him. On reflection, I will never contain the whole of it, he said. The mirror too small for the long neck lamp, floating swan-like near the angle of incidence. Never, he said, stepping back from the lectern and long neck lamp, the mirror he held too small for the swan. To reflect the object entirely, he said, stepping back to the lectern, the glass must be half the source's height. To reflect the object entirely, the lamp or a swan or my figure before you, the glass must be half the source's height. Unlike thought, which easily triples the whole. My figure before you, the lamp swan, reflects my object entirely. That is, unlike thought, which easily triples or transforms the whole, the mirror is held by harmony, entirely, unlike the object reflected. Finally, when you back away from the glass, your image, the mirror is held by harmony, always doubles the distance between you. As it finally backs away through the glass, light doubling its loss through angles of reflection, your image doubles the distance between you, always twice as far from the source as you are before it. Like a thought, doubly lost through an act of reflection, floating swan-like past its angle of incidence, twice as far from its mate as a lamp from a mirror that will never contain the whole of it. This sort of sense of striving and not getting there, and Roget striving and not getting there, and as you'll hear, I only have a few left, Woolf in doing the same thing is, I think, the central theme of the book. Back to Dürer, in his journals, he had this wonderful way of putting a slant mark in whenever he bought something, did something, traded something, and he just, I don't know exactly what propelled him, but it was his way of accounting. And so that you would find that he would say, I met up with my friend, Borscht yesterday, boom, 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 4 times. But also the things that he wanted, and he undervalued his drawings. And so he would trade a drawing for something he craved, like an elk's hoof. And you would see, traded drawing for this. So this poem is, everything in it is absolutely true. And you will find near the end of it, I listed a number of his etchings or drawings, paintings that he gave to his servants. And at the very end, he attended the great procession of Our Lady's Assumption, and then watched, because that procession had all of the tradespeople coming according to what their trade was. So you'd have the different people, and whatever their guilds were, they all walked together. So this one is in Dürer's voice. Well, it's Linda's voice through Dürer. Accountancy, Dürer in Antwerp. And if you had the text, you would be able to see all of the little slant marks, but you don't, and so I'll just make a little line. Accountancy. This many times have I dined with the factor, thus often with Straker, thus with my lords. I am drawn to the fishes and to citrons sugared like frost over gemstones. In trade for my portraits, I have taken a branch of white coral, a cedarwood rosary, an ounce of good ultramarine, and a great fish scale that gauzes the day through its intricate lens. This many times have mummers amused me. 14 florins to date for raisins, 2 for a brush, 1 for a buffalo horn. 20 florins in all for firewood, flax, 1 elk's hoof, 1 parrot cage. In December, 4 florins gold for a little baboon who nods like Erasmus when darkness descends. There is solace, I find, in accountancy, the prudent, resonant thrift of an evening's meal preserved in a slant mark, like the solace I feel with needle and ink, time's cantering beast, furred for eternity by a burin's bite. To Johann, 1 passion. To the surgeon and house servant, each a life of Our Lady. To Conrad, in service of the emperor's daughter, 1 melancholy, 3 Marys, a Eustace, a Nemesis, a Jerome in his cell. Arranged on a wall, these gifts might mirror our human progression, as the great procession of Our Lady's Assumption mirrored our ranks, butcher to saint. This many times has a fever consumed me. I have dined again with my lords. At the feast of Our Lady's Assumption, just after craftsmen in the great procession, but before prophets and an armored St. George, came a crowd of widows garbed in white linen, accounting for losses amongst us. Silent, in step, they seemed not shape but vacancy, a lit between mason and seamstress, foot soldier and clerk. They seemed the space and etch mark freeze, the empty trough that shape awaits. Grand day, carmine and boot black and the swirling world, and those stately widows defining our borders, these times did their passing enfold me. And now in the last movements of the book, back to Woolf, who spent during World War II a lot of her time in her country home, and she was able to see the bombers flying over on their way to London. She has, if you haven't read the journals, some of the most amazing writing about the war and loss. And what was interesting to me was every time she would put in an image of destruction, she would follow it by an image of revival, and usually the beauty of the natural world. One of the things she said in her journals was, "I cannot form letters." And I think she meant, I cannot seem to shape a letter to send to a friend. But I always felt that she also meant I can't shape them, the words. And what was so ironic was that she was doing the opposite, shaping them so beautifully. At some of that confusion I've tried to capture in this poem called The Moths. You will hear a reference to Caburn, which is Mount Caburn. When she was in her country home, she could see that mountain. A beautiful haystack that she could see from her window and she would walk by. And a reference to Duncan Grant, an artist friend of hers. The moths. Up through the war they streamed, the blunt bombers, rushing toward her unbidden between tea and dinner. But no, the moths rushed toward her unbidden, and years before, lovely, alit by the same luminous window she papered just this morning, after her walk on the marsh, when guns rumbled on the channel ports. But no, it was thunder that rumbled, although under the storm the guns of Flanders softly popped. How the war obsesses, and she cannot form letters, or forms them as echoes, words drawn back through the years, their figures confused. No, fused. For hadn't the Messerschmitt crashed on Caburn's summit, crowned the mountain like a blunt moth, wings extended? There is petrol saved for suicide, Leonard said, should Hitler win, and on the lilacs, perfect summer weather. So they go on, panic, then bulls on the green lawn. The buzz of propellers just overhead, and at sunset, the glow of Boughton's haystack. Midway through her walk, when the air raid siren bleated, she looked to the haystack for refuge, a filigree of camouflage, but no, the sky stayed clear and she hurried on. Once, Duncan said, near Charleston, high in a cloudless sky, he watched a bomber crumble instantly, just a flash and almost silent click. Sunset, a wash of poppies in the corn, and do moths circle the haystacks almost light, as bombers circle the almost seen, one weighted, one weightless, one poisoned, one benign, bracketing the hour. She cannot form letters, looks out through the marsh. Had she entered the sweet hay, rewoven its skein above her, dropped back and back through the years until she was nothing but cells in a larval slick, would the soul reopen, borderless? But no, always the outer bracket closes. High in the cloudless sky, Duncan said. Silver pencil, puff of smoke. And then two more, one very short, and then the last poem in the book, which isn't very long. On a hike in the Olympics, my partner and I climbed up to see the wreckage of a plane. It was a World War II plane that had crashed there, but it was actually being used as a rescue plane, and it was in the 1950s. And in that particular, I looked it up online, one man in that plane had gotten out and helped a number of others down the mountain. It had hit a mountain. And so in this particular poem, very short poem, you have a questioner, like a journalist perhaps, asking him about that incident, and he is answering, but he's not connected to the questions quite. And it's this sort of lack of communication, I think, that's finally resolved at the end. The poem actually had its true origin when a writer friend of mine told me that he had been standing on a hill in Montana and heard the geese flying over. And when he heard them flying, he could hear their bones working. And I said to him, well, what was the sound of that? And I said, was it like a clicking? He said, no, not a clicking. And we went back and forth, and we never could nail it. And so I put that image in my journal, geese flying, what sound? And then years later, when I saw this plane, these two things came together. So it's called Salvage. If you had the poem, you would see the interrogator, the journalist, is in italics. It won't matter. You will be able to hear that. What was the sound? A rasp? No, not a rasp. A rattle then? No, not that. And twice it passed over you? I sat at the waist gunner window, night, and the wingtips flashing light bit through slanted snow, green, green. Then we struck the mountain. And of 8, 5 were thrown free and survived. I was cast into deep snow, and plane-shaped debris slipped over me. It sound a scraping? No, not a scraping. It slipped down the canyon wall, and I followed its snow trough, then guided the others to me with blasts from my May West whistle. Yours was a rescue mission, far from war? I was alone, and just overhead in the darkness, snow geese and trumpeter swans passed, and the green light flashed. I could hear their bodies working, and you sat at the waist, ligament, ligature, the labor of leaving. In unison then, a thrum? No, each sound in its slender chamber. And you whistled them down to you? Yes. Okay, then I'm going to just end with this, the last poem in the book. It's in 8 sections. Don't topple from your seats. They're not long. One of them only has 5 words. I hope that this sort of brings together the striving of all of the characters in the book. It starts with a section on Wagner. And when Wagner was in Venice, he was in a gondola. And a lot of fog had descended. And as he was going along, the fog dissipated. And the gondolier called out, well, you'll hear in the poem, Venezia, as the city returned to him. And Wagner was so taken by the sound of that he said, I think I'll make it the shepherd's horn in the opera Tristan and Isolde. So that's where this first part of this poem starts, from that opera. The other sections, we have Leonard Woolf and Virginia listening to the opera on their record player. Leonard has a memory, talks about it. Virginia, that leads Virginia to say something that's not quite connected. And so they tumble forward through the sections of this book. A few of the lines, like the grimy ivy hung from the grimy walls, are taken directly from Leonard's journals, and one or two from Virginia's too. It's called The Shepherd's Horn. 1. Then moonlight burned through the low fog, and back he came, the gondolier. First head and torso bent over the long oar, then black shoes soft on the stern's worn track. And Wagner, his back to the prow, saw it all as a slow unveiling, the figure moving his huge sweep, and behind him the spires and funnel-shaped chimneys, then the marbled walls and porticos, then at last, all along the canal, the black-cast, algae-slick stairs, stepping down through the lapping water. And then Wagner wrote, sound drew what moonlight had drawn. From the gondolier a wail began, not unlike the cry of an animal, and slowly strengthened and formed itself from long-drawn "oh" to the simple notes Venezia. And the sound Wagner wrote revealed the place, and the place the past, and the past the echo that, like the watery sweep of an oar, carried him backward into the future, and became in turn the long-drawn wail of the shepherd's horn at the launch of Tristan's third act. 2. A meadow with sheep. Lifting the gramophone's ebony arm, Leonard said how the horn, the shepherd's horn, once again brought back his childhood. And the painting, high on the dining room wall, a meadow with sheep. And although Wagner's opera rejects the daylit world, its false revelations, still, Leonard said, the horn recalls the daylit scene widening as the note holds. How here and there paint buckled like sealing wax and textured the sheep. Then the real sunlight, how it brought from the wooden floor a dozen amber currants, and from the carpet where he sat, a woolen garden. 3. Blank. The land today was a canvas blank, no shepherd, no sheep, just frost, burning white, Virginia said, burning blue. Then the elms red. And what was that phrase she forgot to remember? Look your last on all things lovely. The war brings a sharp, immediate sorrow. Tavistock Square is no more. It swells, then fades, as urgent sorrow must. Then through a shallow wash of sunlight, high on a slender elm, some deeper cosmic sadness opens its blunt wings. Then it too somehow lives. Red, purple, dove blue, gray. I did not mean to describe once more, she said, the downs in snow. But it came. 4. His childhood garden seemed touched by snow, although it was August. Each long abandoned brittle stalk chafed to dust. No sound as he stood there, Leonard said, no wind. He was 5. The grimy ivy drooped on the grimy walls. And across the walls from leaf to leaf were dozens and dozens of spider webs, each pocked by a bead of spider. And it came to him then, for the first time, the cosmic sorrow she mentioned, when all of the windows are dark down the street, and the dust is unmoving, and desire fails. 5. To transcend desire, Tristan said, transcend the world. Then Wagner placed him in a castle garden under a lime tree, downstage from a castle gate, and said to him, now you are home amidst your meadows and delights in the light of the old sun. And Tristan answered, is there any anguish which does not revive in its beams? 6. Then it too somehow lives. 7. Why try again to make the familiar catalog, the frost, the elms, the colors, red, blue, dove gray. She had written, Virginia said, last night a great heavy plunge of balm under the window, and then directly thereafter of the elm tree's leaves against the sky, of the cows feeding, of the pear tree swagged with pears. Beauty, pity. Why try again to make the familiar catalog from which something always escapes? 8, from which something always escapes. And shall they listen again to the opera's first notes, their rise and fall like long oars inching a ship toward Cornwall? And did he remember their walks years ago, the line of straw they placed near the river to measure its height? Fog thick on the water, a boatman's voice far down the towpath. Why try again? Morning, rooks in the trees, how she had written the deer exactly matched the bracken, and then they do not. How over the water a horn sounded, then a deer escaped its camouflage and fled up the steep embankment. For better or worse, beauty or pity, did he remember how that bounding shape broke free? That's all. Thank you very much. Because it goes by fast. But I thought that's what I've been talking to you about for a long time. We do stuff. Next year, it was
Happy birthday to
But I can't get 5 candles out. Gosh. Going to the, okay.
Okay, what about a fork?
Fork stick. Isn't that?
Yeah, I had drinks with them and soup afterward.
It's new. It's very